Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
I would like to wish everybody a good morning, and for some of our guests, a good afternoon. I'm Sam Brannon, and I'm a senior fellow in the CSIS International Security Program, and I'm also the director of the Risk and Foresight Group. And I am delighted this morning to do basically what is my favorite part of a think tank job, which is to have an interesting conversation with interesting people and to include all of you in it. And the diversity of speakers today is noteworthy in terms of the sectors that they represent and their own personal backgrounds. And I am hoping that we are bringing together a group that will have some very different views on our subject today. And that subject is, what are the macro trends, the major forces that will be formative in the world of 2021 and beyond? So in a way, we're looking forward, and we're also going to look back, given the extraordinary events of the last year. So I would say, a year ago today, we were all coming to grips with the pandemic that would define much of the past year. And we're at a different point now than we were then, certainly. But let's start by just acknowledging that there have been three macro trends that have had a profound effect over the past year. The first being the pandemic. And if you're watching this event, there's a good chance that the number of articles you've read over the past year about how COVID will be a hinge point in history and reshape the future have probably numbered in the dozens, if not hundreds. So we're going to do a little bit of checking in on how right we were about some of those early predictions as we make future predictions. But I would also say that two other major events have occurred over the past year that may be even more formative in a historian perspective sense, writing the history of this period of time, say 50 years from now, than COVID itself. And the first is the election of Joe Biden. And I'm not going to try to explain why Joe Biden won the presidency in the United States, but I think that we can all agree that the world and the United States are on a much different policy course here. And of course, addressing the virus was central to his campaign. And so the United States is playing a different role in the world, I would say, than had that election outcome gone a different way. The second, which preceded that and may in fact have been a factor in some ways, is of course how China itself handled its role as the origin point of the virus, and in many ways increased some of the activities that were most concerning to those in the world that occurred before the virus. But there's also another part of the story, which is that China's economy recovered more strongly than any other major economy in the world. And so that is really setting the stage as the US and Europe still struggle to get their feet back under them in terms of major economies in the world. So here we are at yet another point of uncertainty in 2021 on the public health side. We have a vaccines versus variants race. But again, there are lots of other factors at play. And so today, our job is to try to illuminate some of those. And let me, with that, welcome our guests and first introduce them to you, and then turn it over to a few rounds of questions. And at the end, I am going to invite you to please have your questions ready. You can submit them anytime. My colleague Christine is going to put a link in the chat. There's a web form. You submit them online, and they will be fed to me at the appropriate time here. So please feel free to think along and write your questions as we go. Dr. Erin Simpson is Director for Strategy Development and Deployment at the Space Systems at Northrop Grumman. She's the former CEO of Caris Associates. Erin works at the intersection of strategy, intelligence, national security. She has a particular interest in understanding the future of war. Many of you may also know her as the former co-host of the Bombshell podcast, and from her prolific Twitter account. If you're not following Erin, you're missing out on all kinds of free advice, from which television shows you should be watching, to which cocktails you should be drinking, to everything you need to know about what's going on in the world. Also joined from Jerusalem by Mr. Haim Israel, who is the Managing Director of Research and a Global Strategist, Head of Global Thematic Research at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. He was previously the head of the Eastern Europe, Middle East, North Africa Telecom, Media, and Technology Research Team at Bank of America. And some of you may have seen him on CNBC and other outlets. His major research recently has focused on growing green tech competition between major powers, massive consumer change coming with Gen Z, lots of other interesting topical issues I'm sure we'll go into today. And finally, let me welcome Mr. Nate Schenkkan, who's the Director of Research Strategy at Freedom House, where he has been for many years, overseeing research portfolio outside of the annual reports you're all aware of. I'm sure many of you saw the Freedom in the World report come out last year with some not so great news about the state of democracy that I'm sure we'll get into. And many of you, as I came to know Nate, probably know him from his great analysis in the past on Central Asia and Turkey. And on Turkey, I think he and I had a rather grim view dating back some time and have been proven, unfortunately, correct on the trajectory there. So with that, let me open our first round of questions, if you will. And this is a lot to respond to. So I'll remind our discussants, we can always come back. You can always respond to other points. We'll make this as fluid as possible with that long setup. And Aaron, let me ask you a few questions here to get us started. What are the macro trends that you are now watching most closely in 2021? And what do you think the drivers are that are shaping those? So what are the underlying factors? And what are you kind of watching to see whether your concerns or hopes for these macro trends are coming true? How are you monitoring the state of the world right now? So with that, Aaron, over to you, and thanks again for joining.
Obviously, I'm monitoring it via Twitter. What else would I be doing? More seriously, thank you, Sam and CSIS. It's great to be with you guys this morning, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to provide kind of a view from Washington, which maybe is less interesting than some pieces of this. I'm very excited to hear what our other guests have to say. And I should also note that I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not for anyone of Mother Northrop or the space sector or anyone else. But one of the trends that I've been watching, and I was thinking about it even before we put this panel together, Sam, but I've been digging into it a little bit more, is some shifts in thinking about macroeconomic policy in general and about fiscal policy in general. And so that's everything from a debate around inflation. Should we worry about inflation? Are inflation hawks just a bunch of boomers who had bad mortgages in the 70s? Or is it a real threat that we really need to design policy around to mitigate and to control sort of domestic spending in a certain way? I'm also interested in sort of watching rhetorically, but also the economic research around modern monetary theory. You know, is there an idea that there is some cap on how much the federal government in particular can spend, the US federal government, I should say? If you have the reserve currency of choice, if you have the ability to borrow, is there a limit? And I think it's interesting that this is an area of somewhat active debate, both in research communities, but also in the policy community. Probably the first time we've seen that since the rise of monetarism in the 70s. And that's a pretty interesting paradigm shift. This is also, and Sam, you'll have some flashbacks for this, the first year that we are out from under the Budget Control Act constraints. And that affects both domestic spending, but very much affects Department of Defense spending. And so I'm interested to see how this discussion of inflation and questions of, can we generate inflation? Should we be worried about inflation? How that relates to the overall budget? And if there continue to be some trade-offs between the demands, the very public and worthwhile demands for spending on domestic issues, whether it's vaccine relief and economic relief or a broader set of infrastructure projects versus some of the core national security and other accounts that I tend to track more carefully. So in terms of what I'm watching, I'm watching the Fed. I'm watching Janet Yellen's comments, which as Treasury Secretary are very different than when she was the Federal Reserve Chairwoman. But also watching the broader sort of conversation around what really is driving macroeconomics and what is the underlying nature of the 21st century US economy.
Thanks, Aaron. I think, debt is certainly one of those trends that accelerated during COVID.
Yep.
And US is one place with a certain approach, but there's also a lot of concern, I know, in developing markets and how if we have major fluctuations in currency pricing, suddenly that becomes unsustainable. So it's very different sort of in the US context, the European context, the Japanese context, and the rest of the world context where every economy's been hit. Haim, let me turn to you. I bet you have some thoughts on those issues as well, but welcome your top macro trends.
Thanks. First of all, thank you so much for hosting me today, Sam, CSIS. It's a pleasure to be here. And when you asked me this question, I really want to echo what Erin just said, but I'm going to take it one step further. If I have to look at 2021, my thought here is that all the models and all the doctrines that we've been accustomed to, economic cycle and interest rate and all this stuff, are just completely irrelevant in the new world. And Erin, I stopped watching the Fed. Literally, I stopped watching what are going to be the economic cycle and what the interest rates are going to be. And let's look at what's happened during the last couple of months, really, to highlight that. So we today, I don't know if you know that, but we live in an interest rate environment that is at 5,000 years low. 5,000 years, and yes, we have the data over 5,000 years interest rate, and I'm happy to discuss after that on biblical times or pharaoh times or whatever interest rate. The reality is that we are at the lowest point it has been in 5,000 years. So yes, slightly interest rate went up recently, 1.5%. No, let's be honest, in a global context, in historical context, it's nothing. We still have $14 trillion worth of bonds and sovereign rates, which are at negative yields, and the world keeps spinning. Since the peak of the crisis in March last year, the Fed have printed $1.4 billion every hour. $1.4 billion every hour, and the world keeps spinning. Nothing is changing. I really think that we're in an environment that all those models, all those doctrines are completely irrelevant. And why is that? Because we are living in a completely new world of technology. We are living in a world that data creation has never been happening so fast. Today, the numbers are just mind-boggling. Every day, we are generating 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. Don't ask me what quintillion is, but that's a lot of zeros that we are generating every day. We are using more and more of this data. We are accelerating very fast. And from here on, we're actually going to use data even more and more, because we're in a situation that big data, AI, smart algorithms, machine learning, deep learning, all those big themes are just making us use technology even faster and faster. So all those questions about inflation and about monetary policy are just becoming completely irrelevant in the new world. And we're going to generate even more data going in the future. So all those trends are just going to happen faster and faster. So I do believe that when I look at 2021, I will have hiccups and we'll have markets going up and down on economic news. But I think the trend we're going to 5 to 10 years down the line is very clear. That's why I completely agree with Erin that she's watching MMT and she started to ask herself about whether there's a monopoly of money printing, whether there's a limit of money printing, because we're just living in a world that all those doctrines to some extent are irrelevant. I don't think they're taking into consideration aging problem. We are living in a world today that there are more grandparents than grandkids on the planet. We are living in a world that there are more 65 years and above than children under 5. All that is deflationary by definition. And I'm not sure that if we have a view of 5 to 10 years, all of that we're taking down into consideration.
Thank you. And quintillion, someone once told me if you had a quintillion pennies, you could cover the earth 5 times over. I still don't even know if that helps us get our heads around the issue, but this point of data proliferation, particularly when we look at the exponential curves of our own creation and consumption of information over the past year is absolutely astronomical.
So let me give you an example. Now, those quintillion bytes, I stopped counting the zeros. So before I'll turn the call back to you, Amazon will send 6.7 million packages. There will be 4.2 million searches on Google. There will be 42 million WhatsApp that will be sent, and there will be 4.7 million videos watched on YouTube. All that just happened, and the call is going back to you. That's how fast our world is right now.
Thank you. Nate, I would imagine you're not going to talk about debt, but you're welcome to weigh in on debt
No,
as well, affecting a lot of the countries you're keeping an
yeah.
eye on.
Thank you. And again, yes, thank you for having me. This is really interesting. And the biggest reason it's interesting is that when I was preparing my remarks, preparing things I wanted to talk about, this was actually in my second basket, but I'm going to move it up since we started talking here, which is about the change in perspective on what states can do, and how that's being reflected in the economic sphere and how that reflects then on human rights. Um, you know, I think one of the things that we've been noticing since the beginning of the pandemic, and we've been talking about since the beginning of the pandemic, is the way that this has shifted the perception on what a state's responsibility is. Now, that's not a conversation that's new in the human rights community. There's always been a different kind of attitude about this than we've gotten from many policymakers frequently about what a state's obligations are and about how human rights are entangled with each other. But the pandemic has really exposed that. And just as you've read thousands of articles about the origins of the pandemic, or about what the pandemic means, one of the things you've probably read about as well, though you may not have known it's what you're reading, is about how all human rights are entangled with each other. So you can't impose a hierarchy in the way that, especially in the American tradition, there has been a tendency to try, where civil and political rights, the right to vote, the right to protest, the right to assemble or associate, the right to expression is separate from other rights. So for instance, when you're seeing in this emergency that the people who are vulnerable are the people whose rights are less protected, what you're seeing is that the right to housing means that you can't shelter in place if you don't have that right. The right to decent working conditions means that you need those rights in order to be able to organize, in order to be able to do your job safely in the pandemic, or to access the internet. It affects your ability to receive an education. And the right to be free of discrimination based on your identity also may be dependent on your ability to be free from a community where there's state or community violence against that identity when a quarantine is imposed. And this is reflected, I think, in what the first two speakers are talking about, is there's actually been a much bolder agenda now for the state to take on some of these questions. We're seeing a real sea change. And yes, I'm not going to get into the economics of it. I'll get lost at sea there. But the fact that in the US, in the EU, in certain many other democracies, you see a really bold agenda to say, look, we're going to take this on and we're going to try to solve these problems, whatever it takes, instead of falling back into we can't spend or we can't take on those obligations because they're too large, is a really big shift, and it has a really meaningful impact, I think, for human rights in the societies where people live. It also reflects, and we can get into this probably as we go, because it's very interesting to see that people list many of the same things I was thinking about, the problem of global competition. And what does it mean when China has had, in their rhetoric and in their propaganda, has had a very successful response to the pandemic, is getting back to growth, like you said, very rapidly. And democracies are at least presented as having failed or having continued to stumble through the response to the pandemic. And that global competition over ideas, over the idea of what system of governance works, is something that, of course, has been going on, whether we like it or not, for decades. But it's sharpened now. I think it's also similar to that first point. It is something that is no longer hidden. It's no longer buried beneath the surface. There's going to be an overt competition over those ideas, an overt competition over systems, and what system of governance will work, and how we'll see that in practice, and how that'll be reflected in people's lives. So I do think those are the kind of, it's interesting to hear that, things that I was thinking of, these are far-fetched ideas for Freedom House to be putting out there, but they're actually, I think, right at the top of the agenda as well.
Thanks, Nate. And I think you actually foreshadowed in some ways the next question, which I'll start with Aaron on, which is, which trends do you think most sharply accelerated or intensified over the past year of the pandemic? What did we maybe fail to appreciate a year ago now that has come to the fore that's really important? And which trends have intersected in ways we may not have expected? Aaron, let me turn it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I didn't appreciate any of these things. I think, a year ago, the importance of a good, desk chair, I hope, something that I won't talk about in detail because it's certainly outside my area of expertise, is the social infrastructure of childcare, and just the critical importance for labor participation, not just of women, but especially of women, across the country. The piece that I was thinking of in this context, Sam, was actually related to supply chains, which is something that we had talked about a lot on Bombshell over the years. And I think the pandemic accelerated both the narrow conversation as we saw shortages or we saw some certain bottlenecks. We also saw that we were reliant on the Chinese economy for a lot of personal protective equipment and other sort of medical technologies and inputs to syringes and other kinds of things in a way that I think many people found surprising. But of course, there had been throughout the Trump administration a pretty significant set of tariffs and other activities around trying to, I don't know, fence in or create some barriers between the US and the Chinese economy. And so what I see sort of intersecting there is the politics and the policy. So that we have sort of some questions around what it means to be doing competition under conditions of globalization, right? What it means to have global supply chains with partners that you don't fully trust their domestic production, both capabilities and sort of trade proclivities. And you know, it's one thing when you're talking about Huawei. It's one thing when you're talking about microchips. That feels very literally foreign to people. But when you start talking about masks and the availability of key parts for respirators, you know, so that, you know, loved family members are able to get the treatment they need in hospitals, all of a sudden this starts to resonate both for individual Americans, but also American politicians in a way that they might get purchase on the campaign trail or more publicly than when it's left to USTR or, you know, CFIUS, all of these acronyms that only mean things to nerds like us. And so I do think that as we start to have those debates, whether again, it's around telecommunications, microchips, medical technology, you start seeing some pushes where you're like, well, it would be great if like some like-minded democracies or allies would agree to produce things together. So maybe the Australians, the Brits, the Japanese, the Americans could do a consortium. Well, that starts to look like a real challenge to the WTO pretty quickly, and you're back to trade blocks. And I think that we're seeing, in terms of acceleration, I think that the Trump administration was certainly gasoline on a fire that people were starting to be a little concerned about. And now there's some, you know, blood on the deck, and we're trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. And I would not be surprised, I guess I would say, to see more pushes towards some regionalization, or at least, you know, so many exemptions and exceptions to WTO rules that you end up with regional blocks as opposed to really fluid, you know, 1990s style global trade regimes.
Yeah, and I know just enough about supply chains to be dangerous. I'm writing about it right now, and you know, one of the things that stood out to me is exactly what you hit on, which is this is sort of accelerating deglobalization forces, and in some ways it's regionalizing trade. But for the United States, there's this real strategic disconnect where, on the one hand, this focus is on the Asia Pacific, but our trade networks are Canada, Mexico. If we're really going to reshore things, we're not looking at Asia. And it's that question of how do you balance those two things, particularly if you're not going to move forward with sort of a free trade agenda generally until you sort of put into place your next infrastructure bill, until you clarify what Buy America means. And I think this is, you know, the layers of complexity. If you're a business trying to plan your global operations, as I'm sure Northrop and others are trying to do, you know, it's a lot to contend with. Do you think that there are countries or regions that are better positioned than others in the midst of this? And is there any getting away from China? I mean, I think on the one hand, everybody was shocked over the last year by how exposed they were to China. I heard a lot from government, from Trump administration. I haven't talked that much with the new administration about this, but about this desire to get out of China, not just on the decoupling 5G tech piece, but overall reduce. But I've seen, when I talk to businesses, where do you go? And so just thoughts on that.
I mean, I think this is where there's a bit of tyranny of geography. You know, so it's one of the reasons why it's hard for us to trade with Asia is the Pacific Ocean's real big. Even though things do move across water, you know, fairly easily. So, you know, places that have some opportunities for diversification within a certain amount of, you know, close geography might have some benefits. You know, we also, Northrop would like to have a few more global operations than it does. We export a little bit less than some of our peers in the aerospace industry. But I think in general, the question of U.S. onshoring and this decoupling is going to be a very challenging one. There's less industrial base here, manufacturing base here than I think a lot of people realize. That we don't have a competing microchip or a telecommunications, piece to compete with Huawei and versus Ericsson, I think is, that there's not a Five Eyes producer somewhere in there, I find sort of baffling. But that requires a lot of state intervention in industry, picking some winners, supporting key businesses in a way that we haven't really been in that business probably since the Cold War, and even then had sort of a complicated relationship with it. So, again, speaking sort of in mega trends, maybe we were at the high water mark of the 90s era Washington consensus and the quote neoliberal consensus, and now we're starting to see, well, if you really are going to do global competition, and global competition requires the state to be involved in some different ways, both, as Nate was saying, in terms of social services and safety nets and rights protections, but also in terms of the economy.
Thanks. Haim, let me turn it to you. What's on your mind about looking back?
So first of all, I completely agree that the situation or the current what we call the new world order, the competition, fight, war, you call it whatever you want, between China and the United States is going to intensify dramatically and accelerating dramatically, especially during the COVID world. And I completely agree with Erin that a lot of those areas which are right now the battleground between China and the US are not working in favor of the United States. Technological R&D, China last year outpaced the US investment, and actually according to the OECD, if the two countries will continue to invest the same rate that you do invest right now, again, in technological IP and R&D, the gap between China and the United States will be more than $300 billion in favor of China. That tells you something. The race of 5G, US have failed over there dramatically, and I think that's actually going to dramatically increase eventually the investment of the US in technology. They have to close the gap. They have no choice. I do believe that US have lost the battle of 5G, but to some extent it's irrelevant because 5G is actually going to be probably one of the most short-lived technologies out there. I know it's everybody talking about the revolution of 5G and the bedrock of technology and everything around 5G, which, let's be really honest, have not been fully deployed yet. But going back to my early point, we're creating so much data that in a couple of years' time, 5G is just not going to be enough. And during the COVID world, we actually data creation and transmission have doubled in a couple of months, something that we did not see in 3 to 4 years. And that's going to continue, working from home, streaming, all of this stuff. So 5G, in a couple of years' time, it's just not going to be relevant anymore. We'll have to move to 6G. US have an opportunity of a lifetime to be a leader in 6G because they already lost the 5G battle. I'm not sure that US decision makers understand that. A couple of weeks ago, China have sent to space the first 6G satellites to examine 6G technology, nanowaves, terahertz technology, and so on. US is still behind, but US has an opportunity of a lifetime to get ahead. So that's one thing I would want to highlight. The second thing, which I think have sharply accelerated, is the Gen Z phenomena. We had a couple of weeks ago, we had a fine example of how Gen Z trade the markets, which everybody were fascinated about, but we were not. This is probably the biggest demographic revolution we've ever seen. Gen Z, by the way, are people that were born between 1996 to 2016. Now they're starting to get to their 20s, and they are very, very different. Now, what happened, I'll explain to you why different, but what happened during the COVID world is that this is a generation that is very well adapted to the life after COVID. And actually, if you really think about it, they were living the online life, the working from home life, and all this other social distancing. They were living the COVID world before COVID ever happened. Now, why they're so different? Because this is the first generation ever that was born into an online world. They don't know any other reality. They were born after Google. Most of them were born after the first smartphone was introduced, so they don't understand what an offline world is. That's why they are so different. Now, unlike millennials, which were born into an offline world, other generations are now becoming more and more alike Gen Z and not the other way around. All of us becoming more and more like our parents. Gen Z is the first time it's actually reversing. Their influence is different, it's going to be bigger, and they don't think as us at all. They are really into ESG, social justice, environmental causes. They are the citizens of the world. According to our survey, 40% of Gen Z said that they don't see themselves as citizens of a country. 40%, it's all over the world. They see themselves as citizens of the world. Actually, people that determined themselves as citizens of the world were below 50% because there were some people that just discovered themselves as people. But that's roughly about it. Think about what kind of a revolution this is for government, a huge challenge for government. They're really into social justice, really into environmental issues. They're not going to finance and bank is with it. They're not going to take loans. They're not going to go to universities. And they have dramatically increased. Now, why I'm watching that so closely? Because of one very simple thing. They are very different. We understand that. Now, they are 10% of world net income, roughly $7 trillion all over the world. They're still small. By the end of this decade, they will jump 5 times, all the way to $33 trillion, which is give or take 1/3 of the world net income. And with inherited money that the boomers will pass, and there could be a chance that this generation could have $50 trillion at its disposal, give or take half of the world GDP. And they are very, very different. They will promote social justice. They will promote environmental causes. They are very active, we just saw that. And this is a trend which I think is going to be very important going forward. And what makes me wonder is that when I talk to industries, when I talk to governments, when I talk to everybody, no one understands what tsunami is coming our way. No, we talk about technology, we don't understand that. We talk about China, we don't understand that. No one understands the tsunami of Gen Z, which is coming. And industries which are not equipped today to Gen Z, and not thinking in their ways, are just not going to survive. So that's my 2 cents on what's accelerating.
Thank you, Haim. And I think on the tech investment point, we've just had the AI Commission in the United States release its findings last week. And I think there was complete agreement from Eric Schmidt and others on the view that the United States is ahead for the moment, and that lead can slip very, very quickly now. And there's a really narrow window of time in which to increase investment and focus. And I think there's been some interesting creation of new positions inside of the White House to sort of merge these really anachronistic Office of Science and Technology policy with the National Security Council, make that connection, to create a domestic policy council to understand the interplay. But the execution here over the next few years is absolutely critical. So I think, this is one to watch with laser focus. And your point on generations and youth, that reflects in something that I think both Nate and I look at, and of course, whatever's on Nate's mind, but I'm interested in his views on this as well, which is this rise of the phenomena of global street protests. And of course, in 2020, the one that we never saw coming, but probably should have, was that the United States, not Hong Kong, not Chile, would become the center of global political protests. And in fact, in my view, a success case of what can happen when democratic systems fail to grapple with the social problem. People go to the street and there's actual political and societal change as a result, which of course now, whether you're in Myanmar or Russia or somewhere else, you're hoping that your system is responsive as the United States, which in many cases it's not. And so I think, again, that sort of battle of systems is playing out, but there's a huge generational factor here. There's a huge expectation factor. There's a huge agility with technology that's outstripping country government's ability to deal with it. Nate, obviously don't want to upstage the thoughts on your mind, but I bet this is one of them.
Yeah, it is, and I'll get to that one in a moment. So let me talk about sort of what the pandemic meant. I'll kind of go back to the basics here. What the pandemic meant in terms of accelerating existing trends around civil and political rights, the stuff that Freedom House really hyper focuses on. So we've been documenting and reporting for now, it's 15 years with the current report that came out last week, 15 years of a global decline in democracy around the world. And COVID-19 accelerated this. There are 42 score declines in 36 countries and territories. Basically, we're just kind of, we're following down this recession democratic recession that we've been talking about now for a decade and a half. And it continues down. It sped up a little bit. The curve got a little steeper going down. The main declines, the kinds of things that you would expect: transparency, governments hiding pandemic-related data, promoting false and misleading information. This was true in a variety of regime types. This isn't just something happening in autocracies, although it is worse in those settings. We also had a lot of declines in personal expression. So people who are critical of government pandemic policies, or people who are especially circulating information that the government doesn't want to be out there, being harassed, being arrested. None of this is probably surprising. People read the news. The questions about this, so two questions. One, will this be locked in, right? So we're talking a lot about ratchet effects, I think already on the economic side, and e-commerce, other kinds of things that maybe would have taken 5 years or 10 years to ratchet into place. They now happened in 1 year. I think one of the questions we have about civil and political rights is, will these ratchet into place? Will these become locked in and become kind of the new normals around restrictions on personal expression, restrictions on transparency, expansion of surveillance measures, especially those that can be tied either legitimately or illegitimately to public health measures. We're looking at all of this as a question of what will be a permanent shift and what will be temporary, what can be rolled back. The second question, then, coming to what you were talking about, Sam, yes, about demonstrations and about street mobilization. So yes, for years, there's been this growing trend of the level of street mobilization, the facility with which younger generations, but also global populations mobilize in different environments. And there's a lot of research, a lot of questions about why is this happening? Why is it so much easier now to mobilize? Why does it appear to be something that sparks and escalates much more quickly? I tend to subscribe to the Zeynep Tufekci argument, which is that the digital component is very important because it allows you to scale so much more rapidly, so that once something catches fire, it can go from 100 people to 100,000 within a week, or even in a couple of days. Part of her argument, though, that I also think is pretty on point, is that it's very hard then to sustain that, because in scaling that rapidly, you didn't build the networks of social connection around which successful social movements are built, the political capital, the social capital that allows you to drive that forward for sustainable and permanent changes. So one of the questions that's definitely coming out of this acceleration that we saw in this year is whether, especially as measures relax, as the weather gets better, in particular in the Northern Hemisphere, whether we will see a major public backlash. And again, another eruption of protest in many different environments, places where people are coming out of lockdowns or coming out of quarantines, or they just get fed up with the existing quarantines again. There's arguably more anger right now towards governments on a micro level all over the world than there has been in quite a long time. And there's a question about how will people express that, where will it go, and how will it be directed, and how will governments respond? Will they figure out ways to manage that and to respond to the legitimate components of it, or will they react with suppression and violence? So yeah, that's very high on our list for something that we're concerned about. The third one that I wanted to emphasize, just because this maybe is more also, Sam, related to our Turkey connections and some of this question. We've had a lot of questions, and we're watching closely around adventurism and geopolitical hedging. I mean, this will get in the weeds perhaps for some of the audience, but what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh in the fall, the war that Azerbaijan and Turkey initiated to retake that territory from the Armenian forces there, really took place in a context, I believe very strongly, of absence of what had been kind of an infrastructure of international order that was maintaining some kind of precarious balance there. And Turkey in particular has taken up this challenge, taken up this decision that they believe that the order that they are embedded in is collapsing, or it no longer exists, or is too fragile to be worth bothering with. And so they're going to go out and get what's theirs. And I think you can see that in different environments around the world. Seeing this in Ethiopia perhaps happening. And I think there's a real question now for Western powers, especially, that think of themselves as protecting that order, of what are you going to do about it now? Now that we know that the global order is much more multipolar, we know that there are other competitors who are offering something else, perhaps, whether it's Russia or China or someone else at the regional level. And how seriously are we willing to defend or uphold that order? Or are we going to let it kind of spill out and see where the chips fall? I think we could see more of that. this year potentially. It obviously the stakes, the odds of that have gone down with the Biden administration. I think some of this was related to the Trump administration and its extreme inward-looking introversion, especially at the end. But that's certainly something that we need to watch carefully all over the world and be ready to act on.
Thanks, Nate. Aaron, I bet there are some themes you'd like to pick up there, but let me just turn it to sort of a final provocation here, which is to ask you what worries you most in 2021, and also what gives you hope this year. And I will mention, I'll start just personally to say what worries me most is truly continued political polarization inside the United States and the degree to which that governs both the ability to recover strongly from COVID and make all of these investments in technology and alliances and supply chains, everything we've talked about before. And the thing that I think gives me greatest hope is that we are on the path to recovery. I think one of the things that we were wrong about, thankfully, was just how good these vaccines would be that we now have access to. And even with the variants, the turnaround story, I would say, for the US, the UK, and really Israel, in terms of how divided society was over public health measures, and now quickly how more united we are, and how much quickly how we're recovering, so our economy maybe can catch up with China and others. So I'll leave it there. But Aaron, over to you.
Yeah, I think, Sam, that's exactly where I'm at. So in terms of the things that give me hope, it's the idea that the governments and the private sector can do extraordinary things when well motivated or well funded. And so that's everything from seeing vaccine development. The US, the UK, India has a vaccine that's also, I think, likely to do well. But and as well as the new Mars rover, right? To see JPL launch and land a new rover on Mars, the Perseverance. There are extraordinary things that modern 21st century entities are capable of. And then we see, that the Los Angeles County has closed a large-scale vaccine distribution site because people were cheating to get in. And so I think in kind of, classic American fashion, right, we can solve the technology. I mean, if it's a technology problem, no problem, right? Like we're on. You want to get on the moon? Fine. Oh, you want to feed children? Well, that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge, right? So figuring out how we translate that incredible technical acumen back to the lived lives of Americans continues to be a real issue. And I would say, the parallel thing that most worries me in 2021 is lack of faith in institutions. So whether that manifests as polarization or disinclination to get a vaccine, or let's all get rid of our masks and distancing, protocols, or it seems much more compelling to engage, to sort of traffic in conspiracy theories as opposed to the messiness and the boring nature of actual politics. The government's given Americans a lot of reasons not to trust institutions, and I think we see that, to Nate's point, in a lot of these protests in other places around the world as well. And I don't have a good remedy for that, but that's definitely on the list of things. In addition, and this is something I referenced earlier, the crushing effect of the pandemic on women in the workforce, I think really cannot be overstated. I feel like I've worked my entire life so that I could be the one woman on any think tank panel that I often get invited to. This is going to be very bad. I mean, it has the potential to have generational effects in terms of both participation, but also then the availability of talent to promote and excite and bring up the next generation. We saw that both, I think, prior to the pandemic in the Trump Pentagon, to be honest. But those things of the challenge of institutions and the nature of this recovery and how we really make it equitable across both race and gender are definitely things to be concerned about.
Thanks, Aaron. Haim, what gives you concern? What gives you hope?
Sure. So I want to relate to what Nate said and Aaron, what you said, because what really concerns me this year, it's related to quite a lot of things that have been said, but I want to focus really on diversity and inclusion. I personally think, and I mean, you spoke about that, this is probably one of the biggest challenges socially that we have going forward. And I really, now we do know the moral aspect of things. We do understand that, no, this is the right thing to do, but we're just not doing it. And I really want to just give you a couple of anecdotes about what's going on right now in the world that shows you how, no, it's a little bit depressing, I do know. And we try to look at it holistically, not just talking about gender or racial, but if you are looking at it from across different groups, everything, so from racial, ethnic, gender, LGBTQ, disabilities, economic, immigration, everything, no, it's quite a grim picture. I don't know if you know that, but no, in the current rate, it will take 257 years to close the economic gender gap. So meaning that women are going to be equal to men at 2,277 only at the current rate. And by the way, that's even more depressing because last year it took 202 years, but we slowed down. Today, if you look at the UK financial industry, there are more Dave or David working in the UK financial industry than women. Did you know that? And actually, there are more CEOs in Australia, which are called Andy, than women CEO altogether. So that's quite depressing. No, in 2020, for the first time in 6 years, there were no Black CEOs or CFOs or board members on the FTSE 100. It's changing, finally starting to change now, but no, this happened last year, only 3 months ago. And there are around 70 countries all over the world that are criminalizing homosexuality, actually some of them with death penalty. And the last thing, which depressed me, I think the most, 90% of children with disabilities in emerging market do not go to school. And the moral aspect is very, very clear. And the social problem is huge. And I don't want to talk about that, but I really want to talk about how much we are missing if we don't go that way. Now, I don't know that, but roughly 45% of Fortune 500 companies have been founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. Now, one example is Steve Jobs, which have inherited in Syria, or Jeff Bezos in Cuba. And if we harness D&I completely, since the 90s, the US GDP would jump by $70 trillion. $70 trillion, by the way, is global GDP right now. That's how much we missed since the 90s. Now, if the US Latino community were a country, they will be the 8th largest economy in the world. By the way, already today, there are more people that speak Spanish in the US than in Spain. And by 2020 and 45, most US speaking Spanish than every other place on the planet. And by the way, if the LGBTQ were a country, they would be the 4th largest economy on the planet, bigger than Germany, bigger than the UK, bigger than a lot of other countries. So we are missing quite a lot with that, and it's becoming a big problem. I think that the COVID crisis actually intensified this problem. 96 million people all over the world have lost their job, more women than men. Actually, women were 19% more chance to lose their job than men. Minorities, the same thing, between 15% in Latinos, 17% when Blacks. So this is just becoming bigger and bigger, and I really want to highlight what Ari said. No. Again, send someone to the moon, great, but solve this problem, which could be done very easily, just doing the right thing. We're just not doing that. So that really depresses me, and I think that's a very urging topic. However, what makes me optimistic is that think about a situation that the war between the two superpowers, China and the United States, that we've talked about so much on this panel, actually going to be to clean the planet. Can you imagine a situation like this, that they're going to be in war to clean our planet? This is exactly what's going on right now. The new battleground between China and the United States after trade and after technology and after capital and after all those things are actually on climate action. The two superpowers are rushing to dominate climate action right now not because to help our planet, but because renewable energy is cheaper today, because the clean tech is actually the new technology out there. There are $70 trillion worth of economic benefits around clean tech. There are $4 trillion of R&D, which every year, which are linked to that. And the two superpowers are rushing together and dominate clean tech. the US have to close the gap. Peak oil is coming, and actually because of this war, climate war as we call it, peak oil will come as soon as 2030, very soon in our lifetime. And actually because this war is happening, it's coming faster and faster, because the more that you are rushing to clean tech, the faster that you are ditching oil. And so we are in a situation for the first time, the two superpowers, when they are colliding right now and looking for new battlegrounds to fight for this world domination and global supremacy, this is going to be about climate wars, and this is going to be about climate action. And as a result, we're going to benefit dramatically. For the first time, this war really serves all of our interests. So this is what makes me very optimistic for the coming decade.
Thank you. And I think I give this very depressing macro trends presentation, but the one section that I revised that actually makes me more optimistic is that acceleration toward decarbonization, which is happening so rapidly. So I think that's a great one to point to. We can race to the top. We can harness competition to unleash market forces. There's some good there. I do wonder where Europe plays in the middle of that, and whether Europe, it plays a helpful role or a spoiler role when you sort of get the regulatory divergence. But we'll get back to that. There are some questions that are related to that too. Nate, what makes you pessimistic and optimistic?
Yeah. Thanks. And sorry, I disappeared there for a minute or two.
I'm glad to have you back.
Pessimistic. I don't want to say pessimistic necessarily, because I'm not right now, but something I'm worried about, which relates to what we've been talking about, is that we won't be aggressive enough in responding to the crisis, and that the response will kind of be to shrug off 2020, to shrug off all of this that has happened, and use the same tools we had going forward. I think this conversation, the other conversations that are going on, kind of reflect the zeitgeist that, for the most part, that's not what's happening. Or at least it's easy for us to say that's not what's happening right now. It's, of course, important to remember that the margin between the response being very aggressive and the response not being aggressive is very slender in political terms, whether that's in the US or in another setting. It can kind of tip over either way right now. Right now, it's tipping towards aggression, and I think that's good. I think that's what we need. We need to take this crisis as a lesson and move more quickly towards remedying these things. The second part, let me talk about what makes me optimistic, and I'll go into a little digression with kind of the democratization political science literature. Apologies, but over the very long period of democracy spread, this 200-year plus period, what you see are booms, so kind of big shocks up, and then shorter ratchets down, and then big booms up, and then shorter ratchets down, and the big booms up, and then shorter ratchets down. That's kind of the spread of democracy and of political and civil rights as a normative framework and as a normal thing that we expect everybody in the world to have. We lose track of that, I think, in our present day, when it's easy to focus on the lack of rights and the lack of access to rights for many people. But the idea that everyone, whether you're a peasant in an undeveloped society or whether you're a teenager in New York City, that everyone should have freedom of expression or freedom of assembly or freedom of association, this is a very strange idea in human history. And it's very strange that we've arrived at the point that we now expect that to be true, and that we're doing things to make it true, and it's becoming more true. And the thing I think we have to keep in mind is that as this ratchet goes on, as we move up, there's a real way in which the backlash to it, the recession, so including the one that we're in now, is frequently followed by a boom, is frequently followed now by another rapid advance upward as we make our societies more inclusive, as we deepen and widen inclusion. So we deepen the criteria on which people are included to include other forms of their identity or other ways in which they express their dignity, and we widen it, right, to more people. We make it more inclusive of bigger parts of the society. We redefine how we look at that, and I think we're doing that right now. There is a backlash to it for sure, and that backlash is inevitable. It's something that takes place. It can be very scary. It can sometimes succeed. But in fact, over the longer arc, over this arc of the last couple hundred years, these waves actually leave a bigger mark than we think they do. And we shouldn't discount, just because it looks like it's rolling back now or it's rolling back in these last 15 years, we shouldn't toss out all the ways in which it's improved. So in that sense, I am optimistic. In that sense, I think that a lot of the changes that we're seeing now and a lot of the ways in which the conversation is shifting and the policies are shifting have a real chance of being permanent and have a chance of being things that we act upon for generations, and continue to widen that definition and widen the scope in which we include people. So yeah, I'm strangely optimistic sometimes at this point.
Great. And the sign of a great conversation. I've lost track of time. We've got 5 minutes left. We have, let me just throw two questions at you, and whoever would like to respond can, and then we'll wrap up so that we're done at the top of the hour here. Collins Chong from University Malaya asks, what is the impact of the worsening geopolitical and economic tension in Asia for a resilient post-pandemic recovery at the global level? So what do raw geopolitics, maybe India, China, maybe China and other neighbors, what do those mean for pandemic recovery in Asia and then globally? And then Pierre LeBlanc from Arctic Security Consultants asks, how will global warming impact key trends? So some pretty meaty questions there to end on. We've got 4 minutes. Who wants to jump on those? Erin, I see you going for the unmute.
Yeah, buzzers. I can take the first one, or at least a crack at it, which is I think the pandemic is a great example of the kinds of problems that led to global institutions and a lot of kind of the, as we were saying before, Washington consensus, globalization of the 1990s, and that any one country can't solve it on its own. Right. And so if, competition or tensions in the region in Asia and the Asia Pacific more generally, undermine our ability to share vaccines, undermine our ability to get to a place where global travel and global trade can recover, then certainly, those are restrictions that will undermine the recovery writ large, and, prolong what maybe we could have come together more broadly. We'll see. I mean, I think that's the shortest, part of this. And I think that relates to the climate question as well. There are things, one of the, I think, real achievements of the Obama administration that we almost never talk about was a climate agreement with the Chinese government. There are real incentives for both countries to pursue this in terms of reducing the impact on their own citizens, their own people, but also making sure that their economies aren't completely disrupted or devastated by this. And I'm really taken by Haim's discussion of competition for clean tech. Question, I guess you could flip around. What would it be like if there was cooperation in pursuit of clean tech and broader distribution channels of that amongst the developed and developing economies, China and India? Not a lot of cooperation going on between those two parties. And that seems like a place where maybe it would be nice, to find ways to do that, but that does not seem to be, as the Quad is taking off in terms of U.S. relationships in the region, the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. And I think that's a very interesting regional framework from a U.S. perspective. I'm not sure that it does a lot to actually reduce tensions or manage the competition with China in a meaningful way.
Great. And I will say we probably need about another day to now unpack all of the meaty topics everyone has raised. I have a dozen follow-up questions. Hopefully this will be the beginning of conversations that we can all take offline. And for those of you online, thank you so much for joining. Again, we will post the full video on YouTube. So if you're frantically taking notes, don't worry, we'll have it all up there for you. Let me sincerely thank my guests, Aaron Simpson, Haim Israel, Nate Schenkkan, for a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot this morning. Really enjoyed the wide-ranging perspectives you had here, the agreement and the points of definite differentiation. And have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your afternoon. And thanks again for joining everybody online.